passage into the holographic universe. It weighs about 3 pounds, yet is so densely packed that it contains more connections than the number of stars in the known universe. If anything qualifies as magic, it would be this micro-universe. It simultaneously controls such a vast array of tasks that it puts the most advanced computers to shame. It bends light into recognizable images and translates sounds into language and meaning. And in an extraordinary magical transformation, it changes biology into the experience of mind. This wizard is, of course, our brain. It has been fairly well established by brain researchers that we use only a small portion of our brain's immense potential. I compare this to having a state-of-the-art video camera with stereo sound and using it to take Kodak-type snapshots. There are various reasons for this less than optimal use of our abilities. For one, it has to do with the ways we are educated. The education of limitation. Our current methods of education are still largely based on methods from the industrial age: reading, writing and arithmetic. Unfortunately, this way of educating does not prepare children for the demands of the 21st century, nor does it stimulate the brain's unused potentials. You see, our brain does not switch on new brain cells until there is a stimulus from the environment, either internal or external. Research clearly shows that the critical time for brain development is the first 2 years, followed by a second period of 5 years. And yet, most children are left to their own devices during the most critical formative time of their nervous systems. Then these children enter an outmoded educational system that stifles curiosity and discourages independent thinking. Most of us are the products of such education. There is another reason we use so little of our potential brain power. The corpus callosum. Neurologically, our brain is split down the middle. In some very real ways, we have 2 brains inside our heads. And these 2 brains experience the world in very different ways. While one part of our brains can talk, the other side is mute. The left hemisphere for most people is verbal. It talks. It creates and interprets language. It performs this extraordinary feat through 2 small areas of densely packed neurons in the neocortex. These areas usually sit on the left side of the head around the ear. If these areas are damaged, one can lose the ability to speak and/or understand language. The left side also perceives the world in a logical sequential way. It likes to have everything in its place. The right side of the neocortex, however, sees things differently. For one, it does not speak. For another, it is not particularly logical. It is quite comfortable with paradox, the gray areas of experience. It is also at ease with things being out of sequence. It can spot the hidden patterns in things that seem out of place. In normal states of functioning, there is a certain level of coordination between our left and right sides. And what allows us to coordinate these 2 perceptual worlds into one whole world of perception is a thick band of nerve fibers in the central area of the brain called the corpus callosum. The more neurological connections presumably in the corpus callosum, the more communication there is between the right and left hemispheres. And coordination between the 2 hemispheres allows one to think both cognitively and intuitively at the same time. There are very practical reasons for using both sides of the brain. Back in the 1960s, an employee of a Swiss watchmaker discovered a new way to tell time, the digital clock. Excitedly he took his invention to his superiors. They dismissed it. "This isn't a clock," they said. "It doesn't even have any moving parts." Their tunnel vision was caused by overdominance of the left hemisphere. They could not see outside their box. The digital watch was just too much out of the pattern they expected to see. A small company called Texas Instruments picked up the patent and the rest is history. Switzerland is no longer the watch capital of the world. As we enter an ever more complex world, we will need to develop greater intelligence and creativity to cope with it. Since the 1980s I have been intrigued with the use of sound in altered states of awareness to increase brain activity and intelligence. Under the auspices of acoustic brain research, which I founded, I even created a series of audio tapes called Mind Gymnastics. They are used to this day by hundreds of people to increase brain performance. As I continue to explore the use of altered states of consciousness to increase intelligence and creativity, I was struck by similarities in people's experiences. It was common to report a sense of connectedness between themselves and life in general. Some even used the phrase the web of life, as if all beings were somehow interconnected in ways that defied logical thinking. These insights were, of course, shared throughout history by many mystics and explorers of mind, including indigenous peoples. A look at the descriptions left by these explorers of mind shows this quite clearly. While the mystical description of interconnectedness has a long history, stretching back thousands upon thousands of years, a scientific description of interconnectedness has only emerged within the last 30 or 40. It has been birthed from the science of holography, and is referred to as the holographic universe. The holographic enigma today, holograms are quite common, but back in the 1970s when I saw my first hologram in San Francisco, they were very rare. I remember walking into the small darkened room of the Haight Holo Art Gallery and having my mind blown. The photos seemed to float out of their frames in mid-air. As I walked around the strange apparitions, I could look into the crevices of the images and see things I could have never seen in a normal photograph. Intrigued, I began to study the physics of holograms. A fascinating illogical world started to emerge. As bizarre as it may seem, you can cut off any part of a hologram and the entire hologram can be seen in the piece. How on earth could this be? Well, you see, holograms are made by exposing film to lasers, and lasers are comprised of coherent light. Every photon is lined up with every other photon. This is very different from everyday light, in which photons are much more helter-skelter. Every photon, so to speak, listens to its own drummer. But in lasers, there is only one drummer and all photons follow its rhythm and direction. The methodology used to create holograms doesn't really concern us here, so I won't go into it. Besides, most people could care less. They just like looking at the strange photos. Now, as I said, you can cut off any part of a hologram and you will see the entire hologram in that tiny piece. Every fragment of the hologram carries the entire image. Another way of saying it is that the macrocosm of the photo is held within the microcosm of every piece. This is starting to sound more and more like the descriptions of mystics. When persons enter deeply profound altered states of awareness, there is often a universal experience of interconnectedness. And this seems to occur regardless of the context or dogma favored by the individual. A meeting in the park. I recall an unexpected experience with the holographic universe in my 20s. At the time, I was walking through a park near my house. It was dusk and I was overcome by a deep sense of calm. To this day, I have no idea what set it off. I had just been studying for one of my classes at the university, and had decided to take a walk. As I climbed a small hill, I could see a river of cars on the street below. Their headlights were lit, and in the dimming light they looked like a kind of moving Christmas tree. Suddenly I could sense the drivers in a way that defied logic. I felt their hopes, their desires, their dreams, and their fears. Many were heading home after work. Some would come home to an empty house, some to their waiting families. As my heart swelled from the enormity of the perception, I also noticed that the air was filled with some kind of energy. These types of experiences were new to me back then, and I had no language to describe it. But it felt like love. It felt like every atom of the world was shimmering with love, and in some inexplicable way that love was trying to reach out to everyone, to all beings. It was reaching out to me, to the strangers driving home in their cars, to the birds in the trees, even to the field mice in the grass, and to the crickets chirping in the twilight darkness. This went on for about an hour, I think. And then the feelings of interconnectedness began to fade. I walked back home, still under the sense of calm that had started the whole thing. But my mind was stirring. How on earth could something like love be in the very atoms of the universe? I was pondering this when I came to a very odd threshold. I happened to be standing in the dark underneath a large oak branch. The other side of the tree was bathed in light from a street lamp. I was in the dark, and the other side was in light. The moment felt eerie, as if somehow the mythic world and this one had temporarily met. As I crossed over from the dark into the light, I distinctly heard a voice speak to me. "You can never go back." I was stunned. I looked to see if someone was standing beside me because the voice was so vividly real. There was no one there. I walked home in silence. I have since come to know that all-encompassing love to be quite real. The ancient Greeks called it agape, or divine love. It continually emanates to all beings from every corner of the universe. For those who have eyes to see, it can be seen. For those who have ears to hear, it can be heard. But most of us never enter the deeper states of awareness where it can be experienced directly. Now let me be clear here. That last paragraph is my own opinion based upon 30-some years of personal experience with altered states of consciousness. As an explorer of consciousness, that is my experience and my belief, but it is just a belief. It happens to be shared by other argonauts of the mind, but it is certainly not a scientific fact or even a premise. There's no way to measure love, and measurement is the benchmark of science. Without quantification there can be no scientific inquiry. I have belabored this point because I am in tricky territory. I am straddling the world of science and the world of mysticism. I do believe that science and mysticism will one day fully meet each other, but the methodologies are so different between the two, it requires a different kind of approach than we are used to. But regardless of what the synthesis between science and mysticism finally looks like, we can, I think, look at some common territory. My experience, mentioned above, was a classic mystical encounter. Practitioners of virtually every spiritual tradition on the planet have reported it. Even though the descriptions are often quite different, the essential insights of these diverse traditions are the same. There is an essential interconnectedness between life and the cosmos. How this interconnectedness is interpreted varies according to the spiritual tradition, but interconnectedness shows up in virtually all types of mystical experience. In his book, The Holographic Universe, Michael Talbot discusses the scientific basis for this type of mystical experience. It is great reading, and I strongly suggest it to anyone who is interested in such things. If the theory is correct, we are all part of the universal hologram, an indispensable piece to the cosmic puzzle. Not only this, but because we are holographic by nature, the whole cosmos is inside us. This is indeed one of the fundamental teachings of most perennial philosophies and mystical traditions. In some inexplicable way we carry the cosmos within us. And the exploration of one's own consciousness eventually takes one into the cosmic realms of existence. We are like Mobius strips. On one side of the strip we are isolated individuated primate humans. Yet at the same time we exist on the other side of the strip as well. On that side of things we are a part of the whole. We are one with all life and the entire cosmos is inside us. Such things seem illogical to our usual ways of thinking. But in altered states of consciousness, we can dip our toes into a different kind of world, a world of extraordinary paradox. I suppose it is because I have worked so extensively in the area of brain research, but I think that a lot of mystical revelation like interconnectedness is triggered by changes in brain state. I recall many years ago when I started getting EEG readings of subjects listening to waveform, a recording I created under acoustic brain research. Many of these persons had profound non-ordinary experiences including sensations of floating, moving through space and yes, feelings of interconnectedness. Now this part was not surprising, but where the brain showed the response was most intriguing. It was at a point on the top of the head. This one area showed massive increases in theta, more than any other areas in the brain. And this point just happened to correspond to the crown chakra in yoga, what is sometimes called the thousand-petaled lotus. This chakra is associated with the transpersonal or universal states of consciousness. This was intriguing. And I spent part of my time over the next few years looking at how such a response could be replicated consistently. Eventually I came to the conclusion that such responses are part of a larger brain patterning, and are related to the person's psychology and values. In other words, while some persons listen to waveform and traverse the universe, others just got really relaxed. And some just went to sleep. I recall an incident with a cardiac specialist once who listened to waveform for the first time. His cohorts had urged him to listen to it since they were considering the possibility of using it in their outpatient stress management program. the skeptical doctor donned a pair of headphones and sat back in his executive chair. He reported being bored at first, then kind of dozing off, but not really going to sleep. Then he heard the distinct sound of a locomotive. Wondering how in the heck a locomotive could be in his office, he struggled to open his eyes. To his amazement, the sound of the locomotive was actually the sound of his snoring. Virtually everyone who listened to waveform demonstrated that it was highly effective at generating profound altered states of mind, but the content varied widely depending upon the individual. Another part of the mystery, in regards to brain function, came into focus when I came across the recently published work of Andrew Newberg, MD, author of Why God Won't Go Away. Using advanced neurological monitoring devices, Dr. Newberg was able to identify an area of the brain that seemed to be crucial in mystical experience. He and his associates looked at brain activity in various meditators. Some were Christian mystics, some were yogis, some Buddhists, etc. Dr. Newberg collected meditators like some people collect baseball cards. He gave each subject a button. When they touched into the deepest state of meditation they were familiar with, they would push it. This marker would be set against the real-time readings of the brain to see if there were any commonalities in brain states. And there was. Regardless of the tradition, spiritual lineage or methods of meditation used, the same area responded. This common point in the brain was identified as the orientation area. This neurological center is responsible for orienting us in space. When we walk across the room, for instance, the orientation area coordinates sensory information to help us avoid bumping into things. During such moments the orientation area is very busy routing sensory signals. Its cells are very active. But during states of meditation, the orientation area went to sleep. Its cells were simply not processing sensory information. It was, in other words, no longer attending to the perception of external space. I think that this radical shift in the orientation area is probably due to a shift in attention. By design, meditation is a process of attending to internal space. One lets the perception of external space drop away. And what's left are experiences from the source of internal space itself, the mind. I had mentioned earlier that diverse mystical traditions universally report experiences of interconnectedness. And such feelings are often accompanied by changes in perceived space. The phenomenon of perceiving the holographic universe or mystical interconnectedness seems to be intimately connected with changes in perceived space, and time, for that matter. Meditators also universally report the feeling that time becomes profoundly altered during their inner journeys. One client, for instance, experienced the birth, evolution and death of the entire universe with its attending sense of endless time. When she opened her eyes and looked at her watch, however, only about 15 minutes had passed. There are indeed fascinating non-ordinary perceptions that often occur during periods of deep meditation. And one of these concerns the perception of non-corporeal intelligences, sometimes called energy beings. In Western culture, such things are deemed nonsense, and in a way they are non-sensory. One cannot perceive them with the five senses. Rather they are, more often than not, perceived directly through the internal senses of the mind. Many cultures and spiritual traditions talk about these unusual beings. Indigenous cultures, for instance, are quite clear that these beings are real and that they can be interacted with. Many Christians believe in angels, and these too are energy beings. In fact, I have had experiences with so many angels over the years, I take them rather matter-of-factly. Now it may seem like a long leap from the holographic universe or interconnectedness to disembodied beings. And one can, in fact, experience interconnectedness without ever running into one. Infinite Pool, the CD, but it was an energy being who turned up in meditation one day, and told me that it was possible to accelerate evolution of the holographic brain through sound. This energy being turned out to be an akal, a being known as an ancient one by Egyptian alchemists. These beings are extraordinarily evolved, and this particular akal taught me how to use sound patterns in new ways. My opinion on the matter, having interacted with energy beings from numerous lineages and cultures, is that some of them have invaluable information to share with those willing to listen. My test for validity is whether their suggestions have practical value or not. In the case of this ACL, I immediately recognized the consummate level of knowledge he demonstrated. And after recording the program in all its complexity, I was even more convinced that this was something of extreme value. The other 13 voices are those of another group of beings I have been working with for several years now. Known as the Hethers, they are masters of sound and love. When I first encountered them, in meditation, I had already been working in the area of sound for over a decade. But their knowledge far surpassed my own, and they opened new vistas I never even imagined. For the last few years, my group of mentors has grown to 13, and the other voices you hear on the recording are them singing through me. These voices create complex standing wave patterns within the brain. As a result, exceedingly intricate geometries are created within these standing wave patterns. This is, for all intents and purposes, sacred geometry in action. The effects of these geometries are multi-dimensional in nature, meaning that several dimensions of consciousness are accessed simultaneously, depending upon the development and awareness of the listener. It's hard to describe unless you actually hear it, but I'll give it a try. Imagine sensing, inside your head, an ever-oscillating field of sacred geometry. Sometimes you sense a circle of light, sometimes another geometry. Each point on a geometric shape emits a tone. As the tones switch on, the corresponding areas of the brain associated with those points are activated in ways that are quite unusual. In addition to this, complex imagery arises, seeming to float inside the head. These images flow from one's own inner world and are natural expressions of multi-dimensional consciousness. I believe that the development of multi-dimensional consciousness is one of our next natural evolutionary steps, and one that can be self-generated. In other words, we don't have to wait for others to develop this capacity. We can attain this for ourselves. There's good reason to do this. The development of multidimensional awareness increases both intelligence and creativity. In a more esoteric arena, the cultivation of multidimensionality allows one to track several states of consciousness simultaneously. Esoteric knowledge is much more effectively retrieved and utilized by a mind that is capable of multiple awarenesses at the same time. Multidimensional consciousness is sometimes referred to as the holographic universe, and the portal to this universe is through your own brain. Through this doorway, you can visit worlds and gain insights you never imagined possible. Indeed, after experimenting with this program for the last 6 months, I am convinced that it will prove to be an invaluable tool for those wanting to access the brain's extraordinary potentials.